November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. The streets are packed with cheering crowds as President John F. Kennedy's open-top limousine slowly makes its way through Dealey Plaza. Thousands have gathered just for a glimpse of the young president whose charm and optimism have captured America's imagination. Beside him sits his wife, in a pink suit, roses in her lap. For a brief moment, everything about this visit to Texas looks like a triumph. Then, just after 12:30 in the afternoon, 3 gunshots shatter the celebration. Within minutes, the President of the United States is fighting for his life. Less than an hour later, doctors pronounce him dead. The news breaks across the country almost instantly, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy shocks not only America, but the entire world. Millions will forever remember exactly where they were when they heard. It's a strange ending for a man who was never even supposed to become president in the first place. He was so often bedridden as a child that his own father assumed it would be his older brother who would one day run for office, not him. He nearly died in the Pacific during World War II, and he was quietly diagnosed with the disease, so serious that the doctor who found it reportedly told a friend of Kennedy's he hasn't got a year to live. And yet John Fitzgerald Kennedy would go on to become one of the most beloved, most photographed presidents in American history. This is the story of his life. From a privileged but demanding childhood in Massachusetts, through a presidency that stared down nuclear war, to Camelot, and finally to Dallas. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts. The second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. Joseph was a self-made businessman whose fortune grew through banking, investments, and Hollywood ventures. Rose was the daughter of Boston's former mayor. Together they raised 9 children, and every one of them was expected to excel. Competition wasn't encouraged in the Kennedy household. It was demanded. Winning mattered. Excuses did not. That expectation, at first, wasn't placed on Jack. The oldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was the one groomed from birth for greatness. Strong, athletic, confident, and in his father's eyes, destined for the White House one day. Jack, by contrast, spent much of his early childhood in bed. At just 2 years old, he nearly died of scarlet fever, and it was the first of what became a lifelong pattern. Chronic stomach problems, infections, severe back pain, and long hospital stays that kept him out of school for weeks at a time, so often that his siblings joked that if a mosquito bit Jack, the mosquito would be the one to die. Doctors couldn't even predict whether he'd enjoy a healthy adulthood, and it would be years before anyone identified the real culprit behind many of his ailments. While other boys spent their afternoons on playgrounds, Jack found himself confined to bed with books for company. And ironically, those quiet hours helped shape the future president. He developed an enormous appetite for history, biography, and political strategy that would stay with him for life. Still, he wasn't exactly a model student. At Choate, the elite boarding school his father sent him to, Jack built a reputation for being witty, mischievous, and occasionally rebellious, co-founding a small group of friends who called themselves the Muckers Club for the sole purpose of needling the school's headmaster. His grades were mediocre at best, and yet in a twist that would echo throughout his life, his graduating class voted him most likely to succeed, not for his grades, but for something harder to define, an effortless charm and a sharp wit that made people like him even when he'd just broken every rule in the building. For years, Jack lived quietly in his older brother's shadow. Nobody, least of all Jack himself, had any idea that fate was about to hand him a very different kind of legacy. He enrolled at Harvard in the fall of 1936 and was not, by his own admission, a particularly serious student at first. But in 1939, with war clouds gathering over Europe, his father was serving as U.S. ambassador to Britain, and Jack spent time there watching firsthand as the continent slid toward catastrophe. touring Nazi Germany, sitting in the House of Commons as Neville Chamberlain justified his policy of appeasement. He turned everything he witnessed into his senior thesis, Why England Slept, an analysis of Britain's unpreparedness for war. His father helped get it published, and to everyone's surprise, it became a modest bestseller. At 23, before he'd held a single day of public office, Jack Kennedy was already a published author with his name in American newspapers. But neither he nor anyone in his family knew that events unfolding across the Atlantic were about to change the course of his life forever. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Jack was determined to serve. There was just one problem: his health. Military doctors initially considered him unfit for service. But with help from family connections, he was accepted into the Naval Reserve and was eventually given command of a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific, PT-109. Then in the early hours of August 2, 1943, disaster struck. While patrolling near the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness, PT-109 was rammed at high speed by a Japanese destroyer, splitting the small wooden boat clean in two. 2 of Kennedy's crew were killed instantly, and the survivors were thrown into burning water, miles from any friendly shore. Kennedy refused to accept defeat. Despite re-injuring his already damaged back, he organized the survivors and led them toward the nearest island, gripping the strap of a badly burned crewman's life jacket in his teeth and towing him through the water for hours. Stranded for nearly a week, with almost no food or water, Kennedy repeatedly swam out into open water at night, searching for rescue, at one point carving a message into a coconut shell that local islanders smuggled to American forces. All 11 surviving crew members made it home alive. For his leadership under fire, Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal along with the Purple Heart. Almost overnight, the sickly young officer many had underestimated became a genuine American war hero. Though Kennedy himself rarely spoke about it, often brushing off praise with a joke. It was involuntary. They sank my boat. He kept that coconut shell, encased in plastic, on his desk in the Oval Office for the rest of his life. While Jack's own reputation was rising, tragedy reshaped the entire family's trajectory. In August 1944, his older brother Joe Jr., still considered the family's future political star, was killed when his aircraft exploded during a dangerous bombing mission over the English Channel. He was 29 years old. The loss devastated the family, and almost without warning, the political future once meant for Joe Jr. shifted onto Jack. A responsibility he'd never sought, but increasingly felt obligated to accept. In 1946, at just 29, Jack Kennedy ran for Massachusetts's 11th Congressional District, campaigning tirelessly through working-class neighborhoods and union halls, and won comfortably. Behind the confident public image, though, he was hiding something serious. In September 1947, barely a year into his first term, he collapsed while traveling in London, and doctors finally identified the source of his lifelong ailments. Addison's disease, a rare, and, at the time, often fatal disorder of the adrenal glands. He kept the diagnosis a closely guarded secret and simply pressed on. 6 years later, in 1952, he made his biggest political gamble yet, challenging the popular Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for a U.S. Senate seat almost nobody thought he could win, and won it anyway, becoming, at 35, one of the Democratic Party's fastest rising stars. The pain never really let up. A near-fatal spinal surgery put him back in a hospital bed for weeks, and he used that recovery to write Profiles in Courage, a book that went on to win the Pulitzer Prize and introduce him to millions of Americans who'd never heard him speak. By 1953, he'd married Jacqueline Bouvier, and by January 1960, with the Cold War intensifying and the country hungry for new leadership, he announced the biggest gamble of his life. A run for President of the United States. Critics doubted a 43-year-old senator had enough experience. Others believed America would never elect a Catholic president. A prejudice Kennedy confronted head-on, telling a room of Protestant ministers in Houston that he believed in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. But the moment that actually decided the race happened inside a television studio in the first ever televised presidential debate, watched live by nearly 70 million Americans. Radio listeners thought Nixon had edged the debate on substance, but television viewers saw something entirely different. Kennedy looked calm and composed, while a pale, sweating Nixon looked visibly uncomfortable under the studio lights. For millions watching at home, Kennedy simply looked presidential, and it reshaped how campaigns would be run for the rest of the century. When the votes were counted on November 8, 1960, the result was astonishingly close. Kennedy won the popular vote by little more than 100,000 ballots out of nearly 69 million cast, one of the narrowest victories in American history. At 43, he'd become the youngest man ever elected President of the United States. On January 20th, 1961, beneath freezing skies in Washington, Kennedy delivered one of the most memorable inaugural addresses in American history. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The words resonated around the world, and his administration, filled with young academics and policy experts, was soon dubbed the New Frontier. Optimism filled the air, but governing proved far harder than campaigning. Barely 3 months into office, Kennedy inherited a secret, CIA-backed plan to invade Cuba and remove Fidel Castro from power. He reluctantly approved it, hoping for a quick success. Instead, when nearly 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, the invasion collapsed within 3 days, leaving the U.S. internationally embarrassed and Castro stronger than ever. Rather than blame his advisors, Kennedy publicly took responsibility. "Victory has 100 fathers," he later remarked, "and defeat is an orphan." The failure changed the way he made decisions for the rest of his presidency, making him far more skeptical of military advice and far more insistent on hearing opposing views before acting. It was a lesson that would prove invaluable within little more than a year, because in October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other point in human history. American spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, close enough to strike most major American cities within minutes. For 13 days, the world held its breath, while Kennedy and his advisors debated how to respond. Some in the military pushed for immediate airstrikes or a full invasion, either of which risked triggering direct nuclear war. Kennedy, remembering the Bay of Pigs, resisted the pressure and instead ordered a naval blockade, publicly demanding the missiles be removed while opening a tense, secretive back-channel of negotiation with Khrushchev. Soviet ships carrying additional missiles began moving toward the blockade line, and for a moment nobody knew if they would turn back or force a confrontation the world might not survive. They turned back, but the crisis wasn't over yet. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, and for a moment it looked as though events could spiral beyond anyone's control. Still, after days of tense, secret negotiation, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a quiet promise to pull American missiles out of Turkey. The crisis ended without a single shot fired between the two superpowers. Kennedy emerged from it transformed, from an untested young president into a leader who had steered the world back from the edge of annihilation. The following year, the U.S., Soviet Union, and Britain signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major arms control agreement of the entire Cold War. Kennedy's presidency was also defined by a bold vision for American achievement beyond Earth itself. In May 1961, he announced before Congress a goal that seemed almost impossible: landing an American on the moon before the decade was out. "We choose to go to the moon," he'd declare a year later at Rice University, "not because it is easy, but because it is hard." It was a direct answer to the Soviet lead in the space race, and it committed the full weight of American industry and science to a goal Kennedy himself would never live to see realized. Domestically, Kennedy's presidency coincided with the growing force of the civil rights movement. For much of his early presidency, he moved cautiously, wary of alienating powerful Southern Democrats in Congress. But as violence against civil rights demonstrators escalated through 1963, his position hardened. In June of that year, he delivered a televised address calling civil rights a moral issue, announcing what would become the Civil Rights Act, legislation he would not live to see signed into law. That same month, Kennedy traveled to Berlin, a city sliced in two by a concrete wall the Soviets had raised 2 years earlier, splitting families and neighborhoods overnight to trap East Germans behind the Iron Curtain. He stood on a platform overlooking that wall, in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands of West Berliners packed into the square below, and delivered a line in German that the crowd erupted at before he'd even finished translating it. "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. It was a direct, defiant declaration of solidarity with the people trapped on the other side of that wall, and it became one of the most famous speeches of the entire Cold War. By the fall of 1963, Kennedy stood at the peak of his popularity. The missile crisis had passed. The space race was underway. Civil rights legislation was moving through Congress. He and Jackie, with their 2 young children, Caroline and John Jr., had become something close to American royalty. A glamorous young family the press had already started calling Camelot. He had every reason to believe his presidency and his life were only just beginning. He was wrong. In November 1963, Kennedy traveled to Texas to shore up political support ahead of the following year's re-election campaign. On the morning of November 22nd, Air Force One landed in Dallas to enthusiastic crowds, and the open-top presidential limousine began winding through downtown streets lined with well-wishers. At approximately 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade entered Dealey Plaza, gunfire suddenly echoed through the streets. Kennedy was struck twice. Texas Governor John Connally, riding in the same car, was also seriously wounded. The limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save him, but the injuries were catastrophic. At 1 p.m., John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. The nation went into shock. Television and radio programming across the country was suspended as Americans gathered around their sets in disbelief. Only hours earlier, Kennedy had been smiling and waving to cheering crowds. Now he was gone. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One before it ever left Dallas, with a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy standing silently beside him. One of the most haunting images in American political history. That same afternoon, police arrested 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had once defected to the Soviet Union. He denied any involvement. But 2 days later, before he could ever stand trial, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped out of a crowd inside Dallas Police Headquarters and shot him dead on live national television. With Oswald gone, many questions would never be answered in a courtroom. Though the official Warren Commission investigation concluded Oswald had acted alone, the strange circumstances surrounding both deaths fueled decades of conspiracy theories that persist to this day. In the days that followed, grief united the nation. Hundreds of thousands of mourners lined the streets of Washington as Kennedy's funeral procession passed through the Capitol, and the image that captured the country's heartbreak more than any other came outside St. Matthew's Cathedral, when 3-year-old John F. Kennedy Jr. raised his small hand in a final salute to his father's flag-draped casket. Kennedy was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, where an eternal flame still burns at his gravesite today. Although his presidency lasted less than 3 years, Kennedy's influence extended far beyond his time in office. His challenge to put a man on the moon was fulfilled in July 1969, when Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. His civil rights push laid the groundwork for the acts signed into law by President Johnson in 1964. And perhaps most significant of all was his steady hand during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Historians still debate many aspects of his presidency, but few question that his calm, deliberate decisions during those 13 days helped prevent a nuclear war that could have claimed millions of lives. John Fitzgerald Kennedy served as president for just 1,036 days, one of the shortest presidencies of the modern era. Yet in that short span, he confronted a failed invasion, the closest brush with nuclear war the world has ever known, the beginnings of the space race's greatest triumph, and the moral reckoning of civil rights. The sickly boy from Brookline who was never supposed to lead grew into a war hero. The war hero became a senator. The senator became the youngest elected president in American history. And the president whose life ended on a Dallas street became one of the most enduring figures of the 20th century. More than 60 years later, John F. Kennedy is remembered not only for the way his life ended, but for the optimism he inspired, the crises he faced down, and the enduring belief that public service could change the course of history. For millions around the world, that remains his greatest legacy. If you enjoyed this look into the life of JFK, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of history's most influential figures. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.